Hi class, so this week we're finishing up with part 5. So we're going to start off with gender and the black jobs crisis. So 10 million African American women wake up and go to work every day. So they prepare and serve food at the fast food chains, they staff the register at big box stores, they may tend to the needs of patients in nursing facilities or provide home care to elders. But often enough, when they're done with one job for that day, they get on the bus and they go to their second jobs. A lot of times, millions of African American women are getting up early, they work in low paying jobs, they may have more than one jobs, right? They have to get up and take care of their own kids and make sure they're off to school or off to daycare before they go on to work. And then by the end of the week, they realize that their paycheck is barely enough to make ends meet. The core of the job crisis facing African American women is low wages. African American women are working and they're working hard. They participate in the workforce at slightly higher rates than women of every other race or ethnicity. But in too many cases, their hard work goes unrewarded. Low wages trap black women together with their families and communities in cycles of economic distress with widespread social consequences. So there are some key elements of the job crisis facing African American women. The first one is that African American women are overrepresented among low wage workers, including those workers that are earning at or below the minimum wage. African American women are impacted by both the gender gap and the racial gap in wages. African American women are unemployed at higher rates and for longer periods than any other women. African American women were especially hit hard by the most recent recession and have lagged behind in the recovery. And African American women in the labor force are far more likely to be single heads of household than women of other races and ethnicities. So, women are significantly overrepresented in low wage occupations and sectors of the economy, contributing to the gender gap in wages. Even within those low wage occupations, women's wages are lower than those of men in the same categories. African Americans are also significantly overrepresented in low wage occupations and sections of the economy, contributing to the racial gap in wages. So, African American women's economic profile is fundamentally shaped by the confidence of those persistent trends. So, some key sectors of the economy in which both women and African American are highly concentrated include service and sales. So, those are the two most popular sectors of the economy where you would see either women or African Americans. Occupations for which both women and African Americans form a disproportionately high segment of the workforce also includes health support occupations, fast food, and retail sales. For example, African Americans make up about 11.4% of the employed civilian labor workforce, but 16.2 of those employed are employed in service occupations. And women make up 46.9% of the labor force, but are 56.7% of those employed in the service sector. So, as you can see, a larger percentage of African Americans or women are employed in the service sector. Women and African Americans are also highly concentrated in healthcare support occupations with a workforce that is about 87.6% female and 25% black. So as you can see, there is a concentration of women and African Americans in low wage occupations such as food preparation and service workers, including fast food. About 61.9% are women, 20.5% are black. And then looking at their race, their household type, and poverty, African American women are far more likely than women of any other race or ethnicity to be single earner heads of households. These households are vulnerable to poverty, especially when children are present. Black women are 3 to 4 times as likely as white and Asian women to be heads of households with children under the age of 18. 17% of Black households are headed by women with children as compared to 4.7% of white and 4.1% of Asian households. Black women are not only far more likely than any other women to be single heads of households, but also within the household type, they experience poverty at nearly twice the rate of white women and 3 times that of Asian women. So the combination of low wages, high levels of unemployment, high likelihood of living in single earners households, and minimal accumulation of wealth and assets has a devastating impact on the economic well-being of African American women and their families and their communities. In addition to that, LGBTQ workers who are Black also face added dimensions of gender bias and disadvantages in the labor force. So African American women who are also a part of the LGBTQ community have an additional disadvantage when it comes to the labor force. So about 2.5 million women labor as domestic workers in the United States. These workers make it possible for their employers to go to work every day by caring for the most precious elements of their employers' lives, which is their families and their homes. So essentially, domestic workers produce the labor power of the families they work for. Those families go to work knowing that they can return to a clean home, to clean clothes to wear, and to elderly parents and children who will have had their basic needs met. In fact, domestic workers have to play the role of nurses, teachers, counselors, tutors, assistants, and nutritionists. Yet, because this work has historically been associated with the unpaid work of women in the home or with the poorly paid work of Black and immigrant women, it remains undervalued and virtually invisible to public consciousness. So domestic work has a history of being devalued or being considered as something that is just women's responsibility. However, if domestic workers across the city went on strike, almost every industry would be impacted. Doctors, lawyers, bankers, professors, small business owners, civil sector employees, and media executives, they would all be affected. The urban economy would be paralyzed. Most domestic workers are immigrant women of color from the global south who have this enormous pressure to support their families both in the US and abroad. So the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights is a legislation designed to establish basic labor standards for domestic workers. This includes things such as including time off, sick days, and protection from discrimination. So as you can imagine, domestic workers experience discrimination and sometimes they're taken advantage of. And so that's where the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights comes in. It was established to set up some basic standards for these workers.
We want to ensure that domestic workers have legal rights and protection on the jobs because the work that we do is real work.
You're expected to work sometimes 60 plus hours, sleeping in someone's home.
There was a lot of abuse, not being able to get time to sit down and take a break, not getting time to even have lunch.
A lot of people don't know that there are so many millions of domestic workers across the United States, 2.5 million. Most of the people who are involved in this work are women.
Yes, right.
Absolutely.
And mostly women of color.
And immigrant women.
And immigrant women.
Right.
And immigrant women of color.
That's yes. Right. Domestic work has been invisible and it's done behind closed doors. Many workers, they experience sexual harassment, they experience abuse. A lot of this industry, workers are undocumented. They're fearful to come forward. They're fearful because taking care of their family depends on having a job.
When I first started in the industry, it was the toughest for me. There were times with scheduling that was a problem because you're expected to work sometimes 60 plus hours, sleeping in someone's home. There are times where you have to, be up early. You could never tell when you're up, when you're down, and they could call you at any time, day or night. And being in their home, you want to be respectful, and sometimes you don't even have a choice.
For me, of course, there are times that I was treated as a gardener. There were times that I was treated as a dog walker. I was always hired as a nanny, but I was expected to be the house manager, a cleaner. So yes, there was a lot of abuse, not being able to get time to sit down and take a break, not getting time to even have lunch, because most times you would sit down, you would be working and eating. Working long hours. Yeah, that's a lot of what I endured in my 20 years as a nanny.
It's a lot of work, and
Sure.
you're doing it on your own inside of somebody else's home. How do you counter that isolation? How do you make sure that you're well taken care of even though you're behind somebody else's closed door?
Well, we know that nannies work in isolation. They're not visible. Working with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, that movement that has been fighting to ensure that that work is visible and that work is seen as real work. It's difficult because society has not embraced domestic work as real work, and so we're pushing and we're fighting to ensure that society, that legislators, that politicians value this work as real work, because that is the work of the future. At some point we all will need care, and we want to ensure that domestic workers have legal rights and protection on the jobs, because the work that we do is real work.
This is really important work. And, I think a lot of people don't know that domestic work is actually rooted in the legacy of slavery in this country. And it has a lot to do with how it shapes conditions in the home and how you get treated as a worker. And in this industry, one of the things that has shaped it is that there's kind of no rules. And that's a result of what happened between a pretty racist compromise, right?
Sure.
Between Southern lawmakers and
Sure.
union leaders.
That's right.
Who actually excluded domestic workers and agricultural workers from rights and from rules that
Right.
would help protect you, right?
It is so important for legislation to be put in place to protect domestic workers, to protect the nannies and caregivers and housekeepers and house cleaners who do this work.
It takes a special kind of people to do what we do. A special kind.
Yes.
We have that patience that nobody else has. To be able to do that job, it's rewarding, but we want to be able to be comfortable and happy. When we don't have to worry about things at home and family and everybody else, we could do what we have to do and more so.
It's important. And that's why we're advocating and speaking directly to Congress, actually, to pass the first National Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. We cannot wait any longer. Women need to be valued. Domestic workers need legal protection, and they deserve the same rights that other workers deserve. They deserve to be valued and respected. We want them to see the value that women play in the home and in the workplace, because this work is done by women's work and by women, and that's one of the reasons that it was, apart from racism, this work is done by women, and it was not seen as a valued work. And so we want politicians out there to stand behind us as women and to stand behind care work and to recognize that care work is the work of the future. To understand that this work is not going anywhere. It's going to increase because more people are needing care.
And it can't be done by robots.
It cannot be done by robots. And it's done by women. Domestic workers are human beings. We deserve the same rights as other workers. We are not just immigrant women. We are black women. We are immigrant women, but we are human beings. And so we want politicians to understand that and to recognize that we're doing valuable work, that we deserve paid sick leave. We deserve paid time off. We deserve to be free from sexual harassment.
So in the US, school funding comes from a combination of three sources. Even though the balance may vary from state to state, on average, it's about 45% local money, 45% from the state, and 10% federal money. Another problem with the school funding system is that it relies heavily on local property taxes, and property values vary a lot from neighborhood to neighborhood or from school district to school district, and so therefore the tax revenue is going to vary. So if you live in a low income neighborhood, then you know the property value is going to be a lot lower than if you live in a middle class or upper class neighborhood where the property value is going to be much more. So since schools are also funded by property taxes, clearly neighborhoods that have higher property values will have more funding for their schools. So let's take a look at some facts about Texas public school funding.
One of our goals in Northwest ISD is to create an environment where families, just like yours and mine, are engaged in our transformational work. As a fast-growing school district, providing services to all our students and staff requires resources. So who funds Texas public schools? You and the state of Texas do. Funding public education is a shared responsibility between local taxpayers and the state. In the past 10 years, the state's level of funding has decreased $339 per student. Who makes up for the lost dollars? You do. In 2008, local taxpayers gave 51%. In 2019, taxpayers are projected to be on the hook for 62%. And that gap is even worse for Northwest ISD taxpayers. Take a look at your tax bill. Your bill shows that you pay property taxes every year to the county, the city, the school district, and other services such as water, hospitals, and community colleges. You might think that all the money that you pay to Northwest ISD stays in Northwest ISD, but that's not how it works. Under the Robin Hood program, some Texas school districts have to give their own local school tax revenue to the state. This money is called recaptured funds. This year, Northwest ISD is expected to give the state $4 to $5 million of local tax money. Since the 2000-2001 school year, the state has recaptured over $288 million just from our school district. The state is not required to spend recaptured funds on education or in our community. In fact, the state can use those funds to pay for other expenses that have nothing to do with education. When the Texas legislature meets in 2019, they will vote on how to fund services across the state, including public education. Our school board has adopted 2 legislative priorities dedicated to public school funding. An adequate funding system where local taxpayers and the state are equally contributing. And local discretion on spending, which allows us to decide what to spend to ensure we are meeting the needs of students like me, staff, and our communities. To learn more or to get involved, go to nistx.org/schoolfinance.
So clearly school funding is an issue, and schools that are in neighborhoods with higher property values have better resources and have more funding available to their schools compared to schools that are in low income neighborhoods where their property values are a lot less. So a lot of times when you think about hunger or who's experiencing hunger, you may think poor people, homeless people. However, that has changed, right? A lot of times people may just be experiencing certain things in their life that may lead them to that. You don't necessarily have to be homeless or poor to be experiencing hunger. So you don't necessarily assume that someone who's white, married, clothed, and housed, or even if someone's overweight, you would never imagine that they're experiencing hunger. So the image of hunger in America is definitely different today. So in the US, more than about half of hungry households are white. Two-thirds of those with children have at least one working adult, and they typically have a full-time job. With this new image, hunger has also been replaced with the term food insecure. So I don't know if you've heard that term, but a lot of times you're going to hear the term food insecure when you're referring to hunger. Food insecure is used to describe any household where sometimes during the previous year, people didn't have enough food to eat. So the number of people going hungry or experiencing food insecurity has definitely grown, and so has the number of food pantries and soup kitchens. So finding food has become a central worry for millions of Americans. About 1 in 6 reports running out of food at least once a year. So a lot of times people think because someone's overweight, well, that means they're not hungry. People make trade-offs between food that's filling but they're not nutritious. So just because people are eating food just to fill them up because they're hungry does not mean that they're eating nutritious food, and so therefore that's where the obesity come in, right? If they're not eating nutritious, they're gonna be obese, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not food insecure. Doesn't mean that they're not going without food. So for many of the hungry people in America, the extra pounds that result from a poor diet are collateral damage, which is an unintended side effect of hunger itself. So just don't assume that just because someone's overweight or obese that they are not food insecure. So not only has the face of hunger changed, but also has the address. Again, like I said before, when you think about food insecurity or people experiencing hunger, you think about poor people or homeless people. However, although the suburbs are the home of the American dream, they're also a place where poverty is on the rise. As urban housing has gotten more expensive and working poor has been pushed out, today hunger in the suburbs is growing faster than in the cities, having more than doubled since 2007. In the suburbs, Americans hungry don't look the part either. So you never imagine that people living in the suburbs are experiencing hunger. They drive cars because it's a necessity and not a luxury. Cheap clothes and toys can be found at yard sales or thrift shops, so it makes the middle class appearance more affordable. Consumer electronics can be bought on installation plans, so the hungry rarely lack phones or television. How many times do you make assumptions because someone has an iPhone or they have electronics? You may assume they're not experiencing hunger because they have a phone or they drive a nice car or things like that. So don't just make assumptions based on where people live or how they dress or the items that they may have. None of these things are a guarantee that they're not experiencing hunger. The US government spent about 11 billion to subsidize and insure commodity crops like corn and soy. So the government spends a lot less on the production of fruits and vegetables, even though the nutrition guidelines say that it should make up half of the plates. So the price of fresh fruit has risen steadily while the cost of sugary treats like sodas has dropped. I don't know if you guys noticed that, but things that are good for you and nutritious like fruits or vegetables, they're much more expensive than buying sugary things or, foods that are not necessarily healthy for you. So we've created a system that's geared towards keeping overall food prices low, but does little to support healthy, high quality food. And the problem can't be fixed by merely just telling people to eat their fruits and vegetables, because at the heart of this problem, it's about wages and poverty. So you can't just tell people, oh, you need to eat healthy, you need to eat fruits, you need to eat vegetables, because that's not necessarily the problem. People know that they need to eat healthy. They know they need to eat fruits and vegetables. It's just that sometimes you think about, should I buy should I spend this much money on fruits or vegetables, or should I take that money and I can get a whole lot more of unhealthy products that would last me longer or would feed more of us rather than just getting, a few fruits or vegetables. So sometimes it's not about not knowing to eat healthy. It's just about how much more can I get for my money.
The way we eat has changed more in the last 50 years than in the previous 10,000. The modern supermarket has on average 47,000 products.
The industry doesn't want you to know the truth about what you're eating, because if you knew, you might not want to eat it. We've never had food companies this powerful in our history.
Everything we've done in modern agriculture is to grow it faster, fatter, bigger, cheaper.
If you could grow a chicken in 49 days, why would you want one you got to grow in 3 months?
When you go through the supermarket, there is an illusion of diversity. So much of our industrial food turns out to be rearrangements of corn.
Sometimes you look at a vegetable and say, okay, well, we can get 2 hamburgers for the same price.
They have managed to make it against the law to criticize their products.
There is an effort to make it illegal to publish a photo of any industrial food operation.
I find it incredible that the FDA wants to allow the sale of meat from cloned animals without any labeling.
Peanut butter contaminated with salmonella.
E. coli has been found in spinach, apple juice.
Smells like money to me.
The average consumer does not feel very powerful. It's the exact opposite. When we run an item past the supermarket scanner, we're voting for local or not, organic or not.
Look at the tobacco industry. The battle against tobacco is a perfect model of how an industry's irresponsible behavior can be changed.
Imagine what it would be if, as a national policy, the idea would be to have such nutritionally dense food that people actually felt better, had more energy, and weren't sick as much. Now see, that's a noble goal.
People have got to start demanding good, wholesome food of us, and we'll deliver, I promise you.
That was just a clip of the documentary Food Inc. that came out, I want to say in 2008. I know it's a little older, however. So it talks about how corporations have taken over the food chains in the United States, and from the farms from where the food is grown to the chain restaurants and supermarkets where it's sold. So the next section talks about Elena, the life as a trans woman, just talking about her life experience and some of the things that she had to, or some of the challenges that she experienced. So in general, there are different barriers to medical system for especially low-income transgender people, and how many states do not provide treatment for gender dysphoria, and ignoring evidence of their medical needs or any psychological impact that it may have on transgender people. So here's a short video, Laverne Cox. I don't know if you guys are familiar with her. If any of you were familiar or watched Orange is the New Black, she was in that show. She also came to A&M Commerce as a guest speaker a few years ago.
I'm Laverne Cox, and this is how it got better. I was born and raised in a city called Mobile, Alabama, and I was born to a single mother, and I was born 7 minutes before my identical twin brother. Growing up in Alabama was challenging for me, I think partly because our family, we were really poor. My mom had to work 2, sometimes 3 jobs to take care of my brother and me, and she was doing it by herself. It was also difficult because I was bullied like big time as a kid. I was very feminine from like my whole life. And from my very first interactions with kids, I was called sissy, I was called the F word, I was called names. The kids who beat me up were often boys, but everyone made fun of me. Everyone called me names. And from early on, I learned how to put on a brave face even though things weren't always that good. But I also think what was great for me as a kid is that I danced a lot. So I would be like in the grocery store, like with the shopping cart, and I would be doing like, a full-on movie musical, like in my head. Like I was kicking and, doing, just doing all kinds of stuff with the cart. So I danced everywhere. I was not really aware of any big picture LGBT anything when I was growing up in Alabama. And I had no way of really understanding that I could be the girl that I believed that I was. And everyone was telling me that I was a boy. And in third grade, Miss Ridgway, my third grade teacher, called my mom and said, your son is going to end up in New Orleans wearing a dress if we don't get him into therapy right away. My mom said, you shouldn't act like this. She didn't want people to think she was a bad mother, I think. And I was a good student, and I was, I wasn't a troublemaker, but like, I was really feminine. And this is like a thing that needed to be policed. Basically, my teachers were policing my gender. The other kids who bullied me were attempting to police my gender. My mother was policing my gender. So there was all these different forces growing up that were telling me that who I was authentically was a problem, that I shouldn't act a certain way, that I shouldn't hold my hands a certain way, that I shouldn't walk the way that all these things that felt very natural to me. I was told that I should not do them, and there was a problem, and that, when I think the biggest thing for me as a kid is I thought that my mother would not love me because I acted this way. And oh gosh, I don't want to cry. I thought, I thought that she wouldn't love me because of who I was authentically. And I began to feel at a very early age that I had to change who I was to get love. So in sixth grade, my grandmother passed away. And my grandmother, we were super close to her. And in sixth grade, I started to go through puberty, and I was having all these feelings for boys. So in addition to being gender nonconforming, I was attracted to boys. And I learned in church that this was a sin. And I imagined that my grandmother was looking down on me and that she was deeply disappointed in the thoughts that I was having. And I went to our medicine cabinet and took a bottle of pills and swallowed the entire bottle and went to sleep. After I woke up, I was really upset that I was still alive. I was really devastated that I had to go on being who I was. I thought that every single thing about me was awful and shameful, and I believed that being attracted to other boys was sin and disgusting and awful. And the only good thing was what I could do. The only good thing is what I could achieve, right? And so what I did, I have to make all A's, and then I'll be worthy, and then I'll be good enough. And the thing about it is that making all A's didn't make the pain go away. It didn't make me believe that I was worthy, becoming vice president of student council, National Junior Honor Society, public speaking champion, getting a scholarship to the Alabama School of Fine Arts. None of that. I could never achieve enough. I initially came out as gay in college when I was at IU, and then these evolved into me really accepting my womanhood. And I think the only way that I was able to accept my womanhood was when I finally moved to New York and actually met the first transgender women I would meet, and those women changed my life because all of the misconceptions I had about who transgender people were melted away when I got to know real transgender people. Meeting these women and accepting them as who they were allowed me to accept myself. I remember the first time I just went full on femme. I felt so liberated. So it was just like, it was liberating because I wasn't fighting anymore. And I was like, this is who I am. And I was just like, okay. As an actor, I have to, deal with my own feelings and be truthful so that I can give that to character. And a lot of my life and what's gotten better for me has been about me letting go and just like breathing. For me, it was really important to be on my own and away from my mother, to be able to say, this is who I am, take it or leave it, And I'm really lucky that my mother took me, that my mother took me as who I am. And it was hard, it was really hard for her to accept me as she I was just cleaning my apartment, and she gave me for Christmas, she gave me this, a daughter is this like a plate with the qualities of a good daughter. And I just found that the other day, and it's like so cool. And my mom has accepted me as her daughter. And it took us a lot of difficult conversations over many years. I think the reality is that she just didn't know how to deal. There was just no template for dealing with a gender non-conforming child when I was growing up. There was no guidebook, you know. I don't know if there still, I don't know if there is now. I've struggled with confidence throughout my life, and I've struggled with shame and internalized transphobia and internalized racism and internalized classism. And so I have all that stuff, but there was something in me believed I had something special. Telling the truth to myself about myself is awesome because it's just a relief, because I don't have to like try to be something I'm not. I can just be. Who you are authentically is all right. The shame is what kills you. Believing that you are unworthy of love and belonging, that who you are authentically is a sin or is wrong, is deadly. Who you are is beautiful and amazing. It's important with all of the messages that might tell you otherwise, that you have that in yourself to say that I am beautiful, I'm smart, and I'm amazing. Earlier this year, I spoke at Tulane University, which happens to be in New Orleans, and it took over 20 years for Miss Ridgway's prediction to come true, but I finally ended up in New Orleans wearing a dress.
How many of you ever thought that inequality would be a cause of death? Well, inequality kills. So you may not see inequality on your medical chart as the reason for death, and you won't see it listed as any of the top killers in the United States every year either. However, social inequality is a cause of death, whether it's because of heart disease or diabetes or accidental injury or homicide. Few of the top causes of death are equal opportunity killers. So instead, it tends to strike poor people more than rich people, the less educated more likely than the highly educated, people lower on the occupational ladder more than those higher up, or people of color more than white people. So among people between the ages of 25 and 64, those with less than a high school diploma had an age-adjusted mortality rate more than 3 times the people with at least some college degree. Those without a high school diploma had more than triple the death rate from chronic non-communicable diseases. And then more than 3.5 times the death rate from injury and nearly 6 times the death rate from HIV/AIDS compared to those with at least some college degree. So people with income below the poverty line were also nearly twice as likely to have had an asthma attack in the previous year as people with incomes at least twice the poverty line. Poor people were also over 2.5 times as likely to suffer from a chronic condition that limited their ability and over 3 times as likely to characterize their own health as fair or poor compared to those with incomes over double the poverty line. African Americans have a higher death rates than whites from cancer, heart disease, strokes, diabetes, homicide, and AIDS. Infant mortality rate is also higher in African Americans. So the lower you are on the social ladder, the worse your health and the shorter your life is likely to be. You may hear that people say, well, poor people in rich countries like the US are still rich compared to ordinary poor people in other countries. Well, while that may be true for material stuff, it is not true when it comes to your health. It takes way more income to achieve a given life expectancy in a rich country like the US than it does to achieve the same life expectancy in a less affluent country or a third world country. So the higher money income of a lower income person in the United States compared to a middle income person in a poor country does not necessarily translate into a longer lifespan. The average income per person in African American households, for example, is about 3 times the per capita income of Peru. However, the life expectancy for African American men in the United States was about 69 years, less than the average life expectancy in Peru. And then health inequalities in the United States are not just about access to health care. Nearly 1/6 of the US population below age 65 lacks health insurance of any kind, whether it's private or Medicaid. And among those with income below 1.5 times the poverty line, over 30% lack health coverage of any kind compared to about 10% for those with incomes more than twice the poverty line. African Americans under age 65 were about 1.5 times as likely as white to lack health insurance, and Latinos were nearly 3 times as likely. Among those aged 55 to 64, uninsured people were about 2/3 as likely as insured people to have seen a primary care doctor in the last year, and less than half as likely to have seen a specialist. So, obviously, disparities in access to health care is a major health problem. But so are environmental hazards, communicable diseases, homicides, and accidental deaths, and smoking, lack of exercises, and other risk factors. So these dangers all tend to affect lower income people more than they do higher income. Less educated people more than more educated people, and people of color more than whites. So greater income inequality goes hand in hand with poorer health. Numerous studies suggest that the more unequal the income distribution is in a country, state, or city, the lower the life expectancies for people at all income levels. So the bigger the income gap between the rich and the poor, the less inclined the well-off are to pay for taxes for public services they either do not use or use in low proportion to the taxes that they pay. So lower spending on public hospitals, schools, and other basic services does not affect wealthy people's life expectancy very much, but it affects poor people's life expectancies a great deal. The bigger the income gap between the rich and poor, the lower the overall level of social cohesion. High levels of social cohesion are associated with good health outcomes for several reasons. For example, people in highly cohesive societies are more likely to be active in their communities, reducing social isolation, which is also a known health risk factor. Differences in status may be just as important as income levels. So even after accounting for differences in income, education, and other factors, the life expectancies for African Americans is less than that for whites. Researchers are beginning to explore the relationships between high blood pressure among African Americans and racism of the surrounding society. African Americans tend to suffer from high blood pressure more often than whites. And studies have found that when confronted with racism, African Americans suffer larger and longer lasting increases in blood pressures than when faced with other stressful situations. So as you can see, inequality has a significant impact on your health. People who are poor, less educated, and people of color experience these challenges at a higher rate. All right, so this brings us to the end of part 5.